She was found dead on the floor of her bedroom in her London house on the morning of July 8, 1967. She was 53 years old. She had been alone. Jack Merivale, the actor she had been living with for the past 7 years, had gone out the previous evening and returned in the early hours to find her bedroom door closed. He had not opened it immediately. He had gone to sleep. In the morning, when he opened the door, he found her on the floor beside the bed. She had been dead for several hours. The cause of death was tuberculosis, the disease she had been carrying in her body since 1945, that had come and gone across 22 years, that had weakened her lungs in the specific way that tuberculosis weakens lungs, slowly and without drama, taking capacity with each recurrence, until finally there was not enough capacity left. On the bedside table beside the woman who had played Scarlett O'Hara, the role that 10 million people a year had watched, and millions more had read about, and that remained, almost 30 years after the film's release, the most celebrated female performance in the history of American cinema. On that bedside table, there was a photograph. It was a photograph of Laurence Olivier. He had divorced her 7 years earlier. He had left her for a younger actress named Joan Plowright, with whom he was still married and happily so. He had gone on, as people who leave sometimes go on, into a new life that fit him better than the one he had vacated. He had written in his autobiography that watching Vivien Leigh deteriorate under the force of her bipolar disorder had been the most devastating experience of his life. He had also written that the woman who came out of her electroconvulsive therapy sessions was not the same woman who had gone in. That something had happened to her, very hard to describe, but unquestionably evident. He was 80 years old, and sitting alone in his house, 2 years before his own death, when a visitor found him watching Vivien Leigh on the television, an old film, one of the early ones, before the illness had taken what it took. He was crying. This was love, he said. This was the real thing. She had died with his photograph on her bedside table. He had died watching her on television, in tears. And in between those two moments, the photograph on the table in 1967 and the old man crying in front of the television in 1987, was a love story so spectacular and so destructive and so completely unlike what it looked like from the outside that the people who knew it best, who watched it from the inside, were still trying to describe it accurately, decades after both of them were gone. Her name was Vivian Mary Hartley. She was born in Darjeeling, India, in November of 1913, and she became Vivien Leigh, and she played Scarlett O'Hara, and she won 2 Academy Awards, and she had a nervous breakdown on a film set in Ceylon, and was sent home on a stretcher and replaced in the film by Elizabeth Taylor, and she received electroconvulsive therapy until there were burn marks on her temples from the electrodes. And Laurence Olivier told her that what the therapy had done to her was make her a stranger to him, and she never stopped loving him, and he never stopped loving her, and neither of those facts prevented the marriage from ending, or the illness from progressing, or the tuberculosis from finally finishing what it had started in 1945. In the next hour, you will learn what happened during the manic episodes that Olivier described as possession by an uncannily evil monster. You will learn what she said in Ceylon on the set of Elephant Walk, when a nurse tried to calm her down by telling her she was Scarlett O'Hara, and what her answer revealed about the specific nature of what had happened to her. You will learn about the telegram she received in New York that destroyed what remained of her sanity. And you will learn what was written on the note found near her body. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something. Have you ever loved someone so completely that losing them felt like losing the most essential part of yourself? Drop your honest answer in the comments below. And if you are finding Silken Sorrow for the first time today, subscribe. We tell stories like this twice every week, and you will not want to miss what is coming next. Now, back to Vivien Leigh, and the love that was also her destruction. She was born in Darjeeling on the 5th of November 1913, which makes her birth one of those geographical coincidences that biographers cannot resist noting, that the woman who would become Scarlett O'Hara, the most celebrated Southern belle in American literary history, was born in the foothills of the Himalayas, in British India, in a house called Shannon Lodge that sat in wooded grounds above the tea plantation country of Bengal. Her father, Ernest Hartley, was a British stockbroker who had come to India in 1905 and made a comfortable life in the Anglo-Indian colonial world that maintained all the surface features of English upper-middle-class existence in the specific tropical context of Calcutta: the clubs, the dinner parties, the servants, the assumption that British civilization was the primary achievement of human history and that its export to the subcontinent was an act of benevolence rather than extraction. Her mother Gertrude was more complicated in her origins than the colonial setting suggested. Gertrude's own mother had been Irish, and Gertrude had been born in Darjeeling itself, which gave her a connection to India that was not the temporary posting of a colonial administrator, but something more rooted and personal. She was also, by every account that survives from people who knew her, a woman of considerable cultural ambition, an enthusiast of literature and theatre who had introduced her daughter to Hans Christian Andersen, Lewis Carroll, Rudyard Kipling, Greek mythology, and Indian folklore before the girl was old enough for school, and who had run an amateur theatre group in the colonial social world of Calcutta with the energy of someone who had always wanted to be closer to performance than her circumstances permitted. At the age of 3, Vivien Hartley stood in front of her mother's amateur theatre group and recited Little Bo Peep from memory. She had not been asked to. She had simply decided that the stage was where she was supposed to be, and she had walked onto it. This quality, the absolute certainty about her own place in the world, combined with the capacity to simply take it without waiting for invitation, would define everything she did for the rest of her life. It would drive her to pursue Laurence Olivier before either of them was free to be pursued. It would drive her to campaign for the role of Scarlett O'Hara, with a persistence that the Hollywood studio system found both impressive and alarming. It would also, in the years when the bipolar disorder was in its manic phase, produce a version of that certainty that was not confidence but compulsion, the same quality amplified beyond any available containment. When Vivien was 6 years old, her mother sent her to the convent of the Sacred Heart in Roehampton, England. The convent was Catholic, strict, and organized around a daily routine of mass, study, and the particular cultivation of correct feminine behavior that Catholic convent schools of the early 20th century had developed into a precise system. The girls rose at 6:30. They attended Mass at 7:15. They breakfasted on bread and butty at 8. The rest of the day was structured with the same precision, leaving very little space for the kind of unscheduled self-expression that 6-year-old Vivien Hartley had been practicing since she walked onto her mother's amateur stage without being asked. She was 2 years younger than any other girl at the school. Her parents were in India. The convent did not send children home for school holidays. Vivien spent her Christmases with the Mother Superior and the teaching nuns, in the specific silence of an institution that has emptied out around you while everyone else has somewhere to go. The Mother Superior gave her a cat. The cat stayed in her dormitory. In the biographical accounts of this period, the cat appears as the single detail that humanizes an otherwise bleak picture. A small warm animal in a cold institutional building, permitted as a consolation for a loneliness that nobody in authority was prepared to formally acknowledge. She found a friend at the convent. Her name was Maureen O'Sullivan, a girl from Ireland who was 2 years older and who had also been placed in the school by parents who were not in England. Vivien told Maureen O'Sullivan her ambition with the specific directness that would characterize every subsequent declaration she made about what she intended to do with her life. She said, "I am going to be a great actress. Not I want to be. I am going to be." Maureen O'Sullivan would eventually become a successful actress in Hollywood, best known for playing Jane opposite Johnny Weissmuller's Tarzan. She would remember, in interviews across the decades, the 6-year-old girl in the convent dormitory who had made that announcement, and she would say that she had believed her immediately, that there was something about the way Vivien said it that made the future tense feel less like aspiration and more like information. After the convent of the Sacred Heart, Vivien attended schools in France, Italy, and Germany. The continental education that wealthy British families of the era provided for daughters they intended to launch into the world with the full complement of cultural accomplishment. She learned French, Italian, and German. She played the cello. She attended the theatre and the opera wherever she was, and absorbed the specific education in performance that comes not from formal training, but from watching an enormous quantity of live theater with the eyes of someone who is paying attention to how it works. In 1931, at the age of 17, she auditioned for the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art in London. She was accepted. In 1932, at the age of 19, she married Herbert Lee Holman, a barrister 13 years older than her. In 1933, she had a daughter. She named her Suzanne. In 1934, she appeared in her first film. In 1935, she met Laurence Olivier. He was 28 years old. He was already one of the most celebrated actors in England. He was married to an actress named Jill Esmond, with whom he had a son named Tarquin. He was, by every account of the people who knew him during this period, a man of extraordinary physical presence and extraordinary professional ambition, a performer whose relationship to his craft had the quality of a vocation rather than a career, who understood Shakespeare with an intimacy that the theater world recognized as the specific intimacy of someone who has found the exact thing they were put on earth to do. They met during a production of Romeo and Juliet in 1935. He was playing Romeo. She was playing Ophelia in a separate production. Olivier's biographers have noted, with the particular care of people reporting something that the people involved found impossible to articulate adequately, that the attraction between Olivier and Vivien Leigh was immediate and total, and of a different order than either of them had previously experienced. He later wrote, "I couldn't help myself with Vivien. No man could. She was already pursuing him before he had fully registered that he was being pursued. He had, in the specific way of someone who has decided that a thing is going to happen and is simply managing the timeline. Made her intention clear through the accumulation of choices. The productions she agreed to, the social occasions she attended, the conversations she engineered, before either of them had directly acknowledged what was happening. They were both married. They conducted their affair with the specific combination of passion and discretion that the social world of the London theatrical establishment in the late 1930s both demanded, and by the account of those who observed it, did not particularly receive. The affair was not widely secret. The affair was widely known and widely discussed. In 1937, during a production of Hamlet, in which both of them were involved, Olivier told a friend something that he would later recognize as the first sign of what was coming. Vivien had verbally abused him without provocation, had turned, without apparent cause, into someone whose rage was not proportional to anything that had occurred, whose verbal attacks had the quality not of anger at something specific, but of a storm that had arrived from nowhere and would depart when it was finished. He did not understand what he was seeing. The vocabulary for what he was seeing did not yet exist in his world. The condition that would eventually be named bipolar disorder was called manic depression in the clinical literature of the 1930s, and was called artistic temperament by the people who surrounded creative figures and preferred to manage the observable facts with the available euphemism. He noted the episode. He filed it in the part of his mind where things that do not fit are stored until they can be examined properly. He did not examine it properly for years. In 1939, Vivien Leigh flew to Hollywood for a screen test for the role of Scarlett O'Hara. The search for Scarlett O'Hara was, by the time Vivien Leigh arrived in Hollywood in December of 1938, the most famous casting process in the history of American cinema. David O. Selznick had been publicly searching for his Scarlett for almost 2 years. He had conducted screen tests of over 1,400 women. He had rejected, at various stages of the process, practically every significant actress in Hollywood. Katharine Hepburn, whom Selznick felt audiences didn't like to see being chased. Tallulah Bankhead, who was too old. Paulette Goddard, whose relationship with Charlie Chaplin had not been formalized into a marriage, and whose reputation therefore made her casting controversial. Bette Davis, who had refused to test on principle. The role had become, in the public imagination, the most desirable female role in the history of American film. The most desirable because the most demanded, because the most debated, because 60 million people had read Margaret Mitchell's novel and had a specific opinion about who Scarlett O'Hara was and who should play her. Vivien Leigh wanted the role with the specific ferocity of someone who has understood, before the audition has happened, that this is the role they were built for. She arrived in Hollywood on the night that the Atlanta burning sequence was being filmed, one of the most spectacular set pieces in the production, requiring the demolition of the old sets from King Kong and other productions on the Selznick lot to create the fire. She watched it from a hilltop with Laurence Olivier, who had come to Hollywood to film Wuthering Heights. David O. Selznick's agent, Myron Selznick, introduced her to his brother that evening in the glow of the burning sets. She did the test. She was extraordinary in the test. Selznick offered her the role. She was paid $25,000 for the most celebrated performance in the history of American cinema. Her co-star, Clark Gable, was paid $120,000. This disparity between the scale of what she contributed and the compensation she received for contributing it was not something Vivien Leigh publicly protested. She had the role. The role was what she had come for. Gone with the Wind was released in December of 1939. At the Academy Awards ceremony in February of 1940, Vivien Leigh won the Oscar for Best Actress. She was 26 years old. She had been making films for 6 years. She stood at the podium in the Coconut Grove Ballroom and held the Oscar and made a speech that the accounts of people who were in the room describe as composed, gracious, and exactly what the occasion required. She was also, by the later account of people who knew her during this period, already showing the signs that Olivier had first noticed in 1937. The insomnia that had been present since infancy was worsening. The mood swings were deepening. The episodes of what those around her were still calling artistic temperament were becoming harder to dismiss as temperament and easier to recognize as something else. In 1940, she and Olivier finalized their divorces from their respective spouses and married each other. The marriage that the world had been watching them move toward for 5 years began on the 12th of August, 1940. They were the most celebrated acting couple in the world. They were also, as subsequent events would make clear, two people in a relationship that the specific nature of Vivien's illness was going to make progressively more difficult to sustain. The miscarriage happened in 1944. She had been pregnant before. The accounts of the period suggest this was not her first pregnancy in the marriage, that there had been earlier losses that the biographical record preserves less clearly. This miscarriage in 1944, while she was rehearsing for the film Caesar and Cleopatra, was the one that the medical and biographical literature has consistently identified as the event that triggered the most severe and sustained phase of her bipolar illness. The relationship between acute grief and the triggering of bipolar episodes is documented in the clinical literature, and what happened to Vivien Leigh in the months following the miscarriage was consistent with that relationship. She fell into a depression that did not lift. She emerged from the depression into a manic phase that was not recognizable as the same woman who had been depressed. The manic phase produced behavior that the people around her found frightening, not because it was violent, though sometimes it was, but because it was so far outside the range of normal human behavior that the available explanations could not contain it. The UK's Spectator magazine, in a piece written during her lifetime by people who knew her and who chose their words with the specific care of people writing about a living public figure, described the episodes this way: moods of intense loneliness and despair, alternating with a wildness which might include running naked through the streets, violent abuse, scorching anger. Once, she bit someone's finger. Afterwards, she would apologize politely, perhaps not really remembering. The phrase, perhaps not really remembering, is the most devastating detail in that account. Not because the biting was not serious, but because the apology afterward, the composed, gracious, perfectly calibrated apology of the woman who had been trained at the Convent of the Sacred Heart and at RADA and who understood exactly what correct behavior looked like. That apology came from a woman who might not have had full access to the memory of what she was apologizing for. The illness did not just produce behavior that was outside her normal range. It produced behavior that was outside her own experience of herself. Even John Gielgud and Noel Coward, two of the most sophisticated and loyal figures in the theatrical world she inhabited, men who had known her for years, and who were not given to easy judgment of people they cared about, did not understand what they were seeing. They thought it was alcohol. They thought it was temperament. They thought it was the specific excess of feeling that the theatrical world had always made room for under the heading of artistic nature, because the theatrical world of the mid-20th century had no other available category for what a person in a bipolar manic episode looked like when that person was also one of the most gifted performers of their generation. Olivier understood more than anyone else did. He had been watching since 1937. He had seen the pattern that nobody else had been positioned to observe. The specific rhythm of the illness, the way the depression came first, and the mania followed, the way the mania was not simply unhappiness amplified, but a different state entirely, a state in which the normal governors of human behavior had been disconnected, and the full force of her personality, her certainty, her intensity, her absolute conviction about her own rightness in any given moment, operated without any of the usual checks. He described it in his autobiography as possession by that uncannily evil monster, manic depression, with its deadly, ever-tightening spirals. He also wrote that throughout her possession by this monster, she retained her own individual canniness, an ability to disguise her true mental condition from almost all except me, for whom she could hardly be expected to take the trouble. This detail, that she hid it from almost everyone except him, explains the specific exhaustion of his position. He was the only person in her life who saw everything. The friends saw episodes and thought it was alcohol. The director saw difficulty and thought it was temperament. The public saw Vivien Leigh and saw the most beautiful actress in the world. Olivier saw all of it. The depression, the mania, the ECT, the burn marks, the woman crawling on the carpet after the treatment, the apology afterward from a person who might not have remembered what she was apologizing for. He saw it for 20 years. He saw it until he could not see it anymore. She was hospitalized for the first time in 1945. She was taken to Northern Hospital in Surrey. She was given electroconvulsive therapy. The ECT of the 1940s was administered without anesthetic. The patient was conscious. The electric current passed through the brain produced a seizure. The seizure was the mechanism of the treatment, the theory being that the electrically induced seizure would reset the neurological patterns associated with manic depression. The treatment was, in the clinical environment of the 1940s, the only available intervention for the condition. It was also, by the account of everyone who witnessed Vivien Leigh undergo it and observed her afterward, devastating. Olivier wrote later, "Something had happened to her, very hard to describe, but unquestionably evident. She was not, now that she had been given the treatment, the same girl that I had fallen in love with. She was now more of a stranger to me than I could ever have imagined possible. There were burn marks on her temples from the electrodes. A close friend who visited her after one of the ECT sessions found her on the floor of her room, crawling on her hands and knees, digging at the carpet with her fingers. The friend did not know what to do. Nobody knew what to do. The treatments that were supposed to help were producing effects that looked indistinguishable from the illness they were meant to treat. And the medical establishment of the era had no framework for distinguishing between a treatment that was working and a treatment that was causing additional damage. She recovered partially. She returned to work. She and Olivier continued their careers, continuing to perform together on stage with the specific professional communion that had been present since the beginning. The particular electricity of two actors who understand each other at a cellular level, who can read the other's choices in real time and respond with the precision that comes from years of working alongside the same instrument. She won a second Academy Award in 1952 for her performance as Blanche Dubois in A Streetcar Named Desire. The role of Blanche, a woman whose grip on reality is loosening under the pressure of loss and grief, and the specific terror of being seen for what she is, was not a performance that required her to imagine a psychology foreign to her own experience. It required her to do something considerably more dangerous, to perform a psychology that overlapped with her own experience in ways that the people who watched the filming found uncomfortable to observe. Elia Kazan, the director, said afterward that working with Vivien Leigh on Streetcar had required him to be more careful than he had been with any other performer, not about her talent, which was not in question, but about the specific boundary between the character and the person playing the character, which in Vivien Leigh's case was thinner than it was with almost anyone else he had worked with. She was Blanche Dubois, in ways that Blanche Dubois would not have found comfortable to know about. In 1953, she traveled to Ceylon to film Elephant Walk with Peter Finch. She had not wanted to go to Ceylon. She had told Olivier she was not well enough, that the heat and the dislocation and the demands of the production were more than she could manage in her current state. Olivier had encouraged her to go. The production company had already invested significantly. The schedule required her presence. She went. On the set in Ceylon, she began an affair with Peter Finch. The affair was, by the account of those who observed it, less a romantic relationship than an episode of manic behavior that expressed itself as romantic obsession. The specific mania of a woman whose illness had removed the usual constraints on impulse, and who was operating in a foreign country under intense professional pressure without the stabilizing presence of the person she most depended on. She also began to break down visibly on set. In one documented episode, she began reciting lines from A Streetcar Named Desire in the middle of a scene from Elephant Walk. She could not stop. The director called cut. She continued. A nurse was brought to calm her. The nurse, trying to reach her through the most recognizable fact about her identity, said, "I know who you are. You are Scarlett O'Hara." Vivien Leigh looked at the nurse. She said, "I am not Scarlett O'Hara. I am Blanche Dubois." She was sent home from Ceylon on a stretcher. The role in Elephant Walk was given to Elizabeth Taylor. The footage of Vivien Leigh that had already been shot was replaced with footage of Taylor. Not all of it, because the production schedule and budget did not permit complete reshooting, but enough that the final film contains a combination of both women in the same role, the join visible to anyone who looks carefully at the changes in skin tone and hair. Back in England, she was hospitalized again. More ECT, more burn marks on her temples, more of the specific transformation that Olivier described as making her a stranger to him. She had confessed the affair with Peter Finch to Olivier. He had been devastated, and he had also, because the marriage was the thing he could not imagine abandoning, accepted her back. They continued. The marriage continued. The performances continued. The ECT continued, periodically, when the episodes became severe enough to require it. What was also continuing, quietly, and without visible acknowledgement, was Olivier's own disengagement. He had been watching this woman deteriorate for almost 2 decades. He had been the primary witness to the episodes, the hospitalizations, the ECT sessions, the transformations that made her a stranger, and then the partial recoveries that made her familiar again. He had described managing the illness as the most exhausting experience of his life, not because he lacked compassion, but because the illness was, in its structure, inexhaustible. It demanded everything and produced nothing stable in return. He had met Joan Plowright in 1957. Plowright was 22 years younger than Olivier. She was an actress of considerable talent. She was also, by the testimony of people who observed both relationships, a woman who offered Olivier the one thing that Vivien Leigh, through no fault of her own, could not consistently provide: stability. A life that was predictable in its texture, a daily existence that did not require constant management of another person's disintegration. He began the affair. He continued it. He fell in love with her in the way that people fall in love when they have been carrying an enormous weight for a long time and someone offers to put it down with them. In 1960, he sent Vivien Leigh a telegram. She was in New York, preparing to open in a play. The telegram arrived hours before the opening night performance. It told her that he wanted a divorce. A friend who was with her when the telegram arrived said later, "I don't believe she ever recovered from the impact of the telegram." She performed the play that night. She went on stage hours after reading the telegram, and she performed because performing was the one thing that remained available to her, regardless of what was happening elsewhere, and because the discipline installed in her at the Convent of the Sacred Heart and at RADA, and across 30 years of professional life, was more deeply embedded than any emotional crisis could reach. After the performance, she fell into the most severe depressive episode she had yet experienced. She underwent more ECT. She emerged from the ECT into a period of relative stability. She signed the divorce papers. The divorce was finalized in 1960, Olivier married Joan Plowright in 1961. He remained married to her for the rest of his life. The years after the divorce were not the years of a woman who had given up. This is the part of Vivien Leigh's story that tends to get lost in the accounts organized around the romance with Olivier and the bipolar disorder and the ECT sessions, the part where she simply continued, in the face of everything, to work at the highest level of her profession. In 1963, she won a Tony Award on Broadway for her performance in Tovarich. Her voice was failing. The tuberculosis that had been in her lungs since 1945 was damaging her vocal capacity in ways that required her to sing through a throat that was not fully functional. She sang anyway. She won the award anyway. She had a relationship with Jack Merivale, the actor who had promised Olivier that he would take care of her. Merivale kept the promise. He was with her for the last 7 years of her life, present in the specific way that the person Olivier had been could no longer be present. Without the weight of 20 years of accumulated witness to her deterioration, without the exhaustion of someone who has seen the same crisis recur so many times that their capacity for response has been reduced. He was also, and this is the detail that the accounts of this period return to, not Olivier. Vivien Leigh told people who knew her well that she had never stopped loving Olivier. She kept his photograph on her bedside table. She called people by the wrong name during episodes, and the name she most frequently used instead of the correct one was Olivier's. She continued to work. She made films. She appeared on stage. She made plans for future productions. She was, in the specific way of someone whose professional identity is the most stable thing about them, more herself when she was working than at any other time, the discipline taking over from the illness in the moments when the illness would otherwise have taken over from everything else. Her tuberculosis worsened in the spring of 1967. She had been bedridden for 4 weeks by the time Jack Merivale returned to the house on the evening of July 7th. She had been getting up in the night in the previous weeks, getting out of bed, going to the window. The tuberculosis made breathing difficult when she lay flat, and the nights were interrupted by the specific restlessness of a body that cannot find a comfortable position within its own deterioration. On the night of July 7th, she got out of bed for the last time. She was found on the floor beside the bed in the morning. She was 53 years old. The photograph of Laurence Olivier was on the bedside table. Olivier heard the news and drove to the house. He stood in the room where her body had been. He later wrote that he stood and prayed for forgiveness for all the evils that had sprung up between us. The evils he was referring to were the divorce, the telegram, the choice of Joan Plowright over the woman he had also loved, differently, with less destruction, with the specific relief of a man who has set down a weight he could no longer carry. He was asking for forgiveness for having survived her, for having found a way to continue that she had not been given. Vivien Leigh was buried at St. Michael and All Angels Church in Berwick, East Sussex, close to the country house that had been their home during the marriage. Olivier lived until 1989. He was 82 years old. 2 years before he died, a visitor found him sitting alone in his house watching an old Vivien Leigh film on the television. He was crying. This was love, he said. This was the real thing. There are 2 versions of Vivien Leigh's story that exist in the cultural record and that both contain portions of the truth without either of them containing all of it. The first version is the romance, the most beautiful woman in Hollywood and the greatest actor in the English language, the golden couple, the love affair that the press followed for 3 decades, the fairy tale of 2 people who had found in each other the perfect complement of talent and beauty and passion. This version is not wrong. What Vivien Leigh and Laurence Olivier had was real and was extraordinary and was, by the account of both of them, unlike anything either of them had experienced before or after. The second version is the tragedy, the bipolar disorder, the ECT sessions with burn marks on her temples, the breakdowns and hospitalizations, the telegram arriving hours before opening night, the divorce, the photograph on the bedside table. This version is also not wrong. These things happened. The illness was real. The damage was real. The ending was as devastating as endings get. What neither version fully captures is the woman who existed between the romance and the tragedy, the professional who learned her craft at the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art and spent 30 years applying it to roles that demanded everything she had and received everything she gave. She played Scarlett O'Hara with a ferocity and an intelligence that the 60 million people who had read the novel recognized immediately as the truest possible embodiment of the character they had carried in their imaginations since the book was published. She played Blanche Dubois with a psychological depth that Elia Kazan, who had worked with Marlon Brando and James Dean and every significant American actor of the method school, identified as beyond technique, as the performance of a woman who understood Blanche Dubois from the inside rather than the outside, who had access to the character's specific terror of dissolution because she had experienced her own version of it. She won 2 Academy Awards. She won a Tony Award. She performed Shakespeare on stages in London and New York and across the world with Laurence Olivier. And after Laurence Olivier, and without any resources borrowed from the relationship, with her own craft, her own discipline, the instrument she had been building since she was 3 years old, and recited Little Bo Peep for her mother's amateur theater group in Calcutta. The electroconvulsive therapy burned her temples and changed her personality and made her a stranger to the man she loved most. The tuberculosis destroyed her lungs over 22 years and eventually killed her at 53. She was still planning future productions when she died. She was still keeping Olivier's photograph on her bedside table. She was still, to the end, the girl who had walked onto her mother's stage without being asked and announced at the age of 3 that she was going to be there. The illness took almost everything. It did not take that. If Vivien Leigh's story stayed with you, subscribe to Silk and Sorrow. These are the women whose real lives were nothing like the images they were paid to perform, and whose losses were always more personal and more permanent than the world was allowed to know. Next week, Joan Crawford, the woman whose rivalry with Bette Davis became the most famous feud in Hollywood history, whose adopted children testified against her after her death, and whose private life was as far from her public image as any story we have ever told on this channel. That story is next.